From Ticker News with Aaron Young, this is Hot Shots.
Thanks for joining me. JD Vance had a very clear message for Europe it simply did not want to hear. So what happens next for Ukraine? The Vice President ruffles feathers in Munich as he hits out at mass migration in Germany and right around the world. We'll be joined by Ticker contributor Ashley Gardner. Plus, the world reacts to two Sydney nurses caught on live stream threatening to harm Israeli patients at a Sydney hospital, the police investigation. And Harry and Meghan accused of overshadowing military veterans in the Invictus Games. This is Hot Shots. Let's get started. US Vice President JD Vance has stirred controversy at the Munich Security Conference by accusing European leaders of limiting free speech and mishandling immigration. His comments overshadowed the crucial discussions on the ongoing war in Ukraine, prompting a strong response from Germany's defence minister, who labelled Vance's remarks as simply unacceptable. The clash highlights the growing divide between the US and European leaders as they struggle to align on critical security issues like migration, as the VP hit out at the migration issue.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course, it's gotten much higher since. And we know this situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade.
All right, JD Vance there speaking in Munich. Ash, I watched this twice because I thought I was watching a movie. It feels like the end of a movie where the hero gets up and says at the conference what they're really thinking. It seemed incredible what the message was, which was you're on your own, get your act together and stop mucking about. What did you make of it?
Yeah, it was like locking a bunch of rather snooty, small L liberal European politicians in a room and making them listen to Sean Hannity or something for an hour. It was certainly...
Cutaway shots back on the crowd halfway through where they realised what they were about to cop after he had been so graciously introduced.
Oh, and he started off the speech very well, talking about how much he loved Munich and how he travelled there privately with his wife previously and loved the city, and was given some, very warm applause. And then as the speech went on, that petered out into a bit of a polite golf clap every now and then as the audience realised with horror the truth bombs that were being
One of them
dumped
in
on them.
particular I thought was interesting was where he spoke about the number of terrorist attacks that have happened in Europe. And the point is that, as he said, it's quite often an immigrant who's in their 20s, known to police, who gets behind the wheel and heads for a market. And that is something that, as a journalist, we've watched time and time again. But to see leaders actually point it out feels unusual. It shouldn't be unusual, but it does feel unusual.
And he did ask the reasonable question, what are you going to do about it? And I think that is the question everyone wants to know, is that these attacks keep happening and happening. There will no doubt be another one in the next 7 to 14 days, that because they just happen. And it is a reasonable question, what are governments actually doing about this?
And an attack had occurred, it's worth mentioning as well, just a week prior, less than a mile away, a similar instance where someone had driven into a crowd. Let's have a listen to President Trump, because questions then head to the Oval Office about what did he think of the speech.
Well, I heard his speech, and I tell you, you're talking about JD's speech, right?
Yes, sir.
I heard his speech, and he talked about freedom of speech, and I think it's true in Europe. It's losing. They're losing their wonderful right of freedom of speech. I see it. I mean, I thought he made a very good speech, actually, a very brilliant speech. Yeah. Europe has to be careful. And he talked about immigration. And Europe has a big immigration problem. Just take a look at what's happened with crime. Take a look at what's happening in various parts of Europe. I thought his speech was very well received, actually. I've heard very good remarks.
There you go, President Trump responding there. What do you think about the speech itself? And also, who would have written a speech like this? And having worked in government yourself, talk to us about the sorts of protocols it may have gone through. Once upon a time, the State Department would write these sorts of speeches, I'd imagine. But of course, the State Department's going through its own reckoning like all US government administrations. So who writes a speech like this?
Yeah, well, I guess an example like this is not like the famous Yes Minister episode where a controversial speech is intercepted by the Foreign Office and stopped in time. This is a bit of a new paradigm that we have in Washington at the moment. A speech like this has, obviously not been written by the bureaucrats and then handed all the way up. JD Vance.
No ChatGPT either, you reckon?
Oh, look, I don't really think so. I don't think ChatGPT could come up with a speech as strident as this one. The one that sort of breaks the mould and makes the world take notice.
So my theory is that it was written by JD Vance and his team, and then would have passed through the White House, particularly the White House Chief of Staff, who would be looking at everything, making sure it's on message. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Look, this is the kind of speech that has been written largely by the Speaker himself, or it would have been a process of JD sitting down with his speechwriter and just having a discussion about the points he wants to raise. He'll line them out, and the speechwriter will go away and write it. But ultimately, like JD is, he's no Joe Biden in the sense that that's a rather strange way of putting it. He can speak pretty articulately. It's the sort of speech he could have just stood up there and just delivered from the head. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was.
Look, let's. There are some detractors, obviously, notably Germany, who are pretty angry that JD Vance has met with the far-right leadership with these elections around the corner, but that was the point that he was making during it. Should we be worried about the US government having closer relations, it seems, with the far-right in Germany than with a liberal, small L liberal party throughout Europe, which has been the case since World War II? What do you think of that?
Well, look, it does present difficulties. It is, I guess, somewhat unorthodox for a foreign government to be having high-level meetings with a party such as Alternative for Germany. But look, that party is potentially on the pathway to power in that country. So I guess
it's extraordinary, isn't it? Like, the fact is that they've gained so much popularity over the last 2 years, I would say, in terms of far right. We've seen it now in France. We've seen it in Germany. We saw Brexit. Gosh, what was that? Nearly 10 years ago, around 10 years ago as well. So there has been a real push for this. One person who is kind of being left out, but the whole conference was about, was President Zelensky. Let's have a listen to what he was thinking, what he had to say.
Putin has lost almost 250,000 soldiers in this war. Over 610,000 have been wounded. Just in the Battle of Kursk, our troops eliminated nearly 20,000 Russian soldiers. We completely destroyed the North Korean units that Putin had to bring in because his own forces were not enough.
All right, and the big news out today is the negotiations between the United States and, of course, with Ukraine and Russia, but leaving Ukraine out of those talks. France getting in on the action pretty quickly, saying we will hold a meeting here as well. Is it a sign that President Trump is so determined to end the war at whatever cost that it will cost Ukraine?
Yeah, look, that is a potential outcome here. I question whether whether this is a sensible approach. Is it right for a leader such as Putin to be able to march into a country, take over lands, draw out the war so long, and then end up with some of the territory?
This is the conversation
we've heard this story before.
Yeah, we've had this conversation though for many years, for 3 years, about we can't believe it. Let's put sanctions. Let's send weapons. Let's send bigger weapons. Let's send planes. Let's send longer range weapons, and yet the Russians have 20% of the territory. The Ukrainians are depleting their own number of young men and women who are being sent off to war, particularly young men. we've seen all, apparently according to President Zelensky there, 20,000 North Korean soldiers completely wiped out, all of the ones that have been sent over to help. This isn't a situation of we want to end the war this way, but when you've got Russia saying, we're not going to attend your security conference in Munich because we've got nothing to gain, they're the ones in the powerful position now. And regardless of what's right, in war with weapons, they won, did they not?
Well, look, we don't want the West as a whole at war with Russia, and so it looks like we are involuntarily being sucked into a program of appeasement. We have little choice unless we want to go to war. Do we want to see Americans, Europeans, Australians fighting Russia? I don't think anyone wants that.
There seems to be a bigger game at play, and that may be that President Trump has said we need to keep China and Russia away from each other, and the war has drawn them closer together. BRICS now seems to be a really strong anti-US movement, and we saw Narendra Modi from India at the White House last week. That's the I in BRICS. So he seems to be determined to break up BRICS and to keep Russia and China in the belief that that could lead to a greater escalation. And it seems to be that if Ukraine gets lost along the way or some territory, that's a price to pay. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, look, again, this seems to be the inevitable conclusion that either way, Ukraine is going to be a shadow of its former self. I think it's that is incredibly sad, but it's probably, an outcome of some fantasies from a decade or more ago of Ukraine joining the West, and while that was a great idea in theory, I think it's a modern, sophisticated, cosmopolitan country in the metropolitan areas. It obviously has threatened Russia.
And I think that there is a bigger question here, which JD Vance was probably referring to, which is, despite all of the efforts from the United States and of Europe and sending tanks and Bushmasters from Australia, it didn't stop the Russians from advancing in the country. They were able to, despite all of the propaganda. I mean, remember, Putin has a body double, Putin's about to die, all of that stuff that came out in the first year. None of it turned out to be true. And yet here we are with the Russians still standing strong, and they've turned their entire economy in there. You go on YouTube and type in Moscow 2025, and you will see a vibrant city, not a city that looks like what we're being told that it is. And I think that from that perspective, we have a lot of questions in the West to ask ourselves. All right, the world is reacting as two nurses in Sydney were suspended over a shocking live stream that surfaced featuring them vowing to harm Israeli patients. The video recorded at Bankstown Hospital showcases the nurses making vile anti-Semitic remarks to a Jewish influencer. Authorities now investigating, New South Wales Police confirming that they've launched Strike Force Pearl to address anti-Semitic attacks is part of that video.
Why do you think? Why do you think I'm gonna get killed?
It's Palestine's country, not your country. You piece
how are
of
you?
shit.
What's your name?
One day, your time will come, and you will die the most.
We spread
listen to me.
peace.
Listen to me.
And
when
you spread
when your
death.
time comes.
How are you doctors? Wait.
I want you to remember my face.
Okay,
so
okay.
You can understand
Gotcha.
That you will
I have
die
a question
the
though.
most disgusting death.
All right, for sure. I have a question though.
Yeah,
I have a question. Let's say an Israeli. God
I won't
forbid.
treat them. I won't treat them. I'll kill them.
I mean, I think you don't really have to say anything to that, except for that clear question that was asked by that influencer, Max. How are you doctors? How are they doctors? How did this happen?
Yeah, it's just it does beg a belief, but that's kind of somewhat stating the obvious. But this does highlight a stream of thought that exists in this country now. A stream of thought that once we thought was very alien to this country. Remember the days back when the general attitude was "Don't bring your problems here." Australia was a haven from all of the troubles of the world, and sure, that might be a matter of privilege and whatever, but that is what made Australia great and what made Australia attractive to people from troubled areas around the world.
The Don't Bring Your Problems here is an interesting one because it's now the 50th anniversary of Vietnamese coming to Australia post the Vietnam War, and when Western forces march into another country and start a war, there are going to be refugees, and there is an expectation that the countries involved in the war take those refugees. When you take refugees, do you start to lose the ability to make sure that you're getting the ones you want, as opposed to the ones that, as you say, don't abide by the concept of don't bring your problems here? I mean, if you're a refugee, you don't have time to think about what your values are. You just want to get out of the country that you're leaving, surely.
Yeah, well, look, I think we've seen over time that the Vietnamese community has very successfully integrated into Australia, and they share the democratic values of the country.
But in the 90s, we had an Asian crime squad for Victoria Police targeting Asian crime because that kind of first generation aspect, doing what they knew to do to make money in a new country, because you have to scramble. And Australia was a very racist place back then, of course, for a lot of people trying to find work. We have had issues with the Vietnamese in Australia, perhaps not so much anymore, but to the point, police needed their own task force.
Yeah, look, as time goes on, these issues do settle down to some extent. You know, you could even go back to waves of immigration earlier from Italian and Greek communities. And you know, it did take time for there to be, I guess, better integration.
My nana came as a 10-pound pom to Australia, and she tells me the story that the racism against her from Australians against the British when she arrived in the 50s was extraordinary. So there has been that side, but we're talking, I suppose, about how we end up in a situation where two people could be employed by the New South Wales government wearing New South Wales uniforms and could be making such vile attacks at work, on work premises, and threatening to kill patients that obviously must go against their code of conduct.
Well, as a first question, you do wonder how people who espouse such views can be part of the nursing profession. I mean, you just have to look at the reaction of the head of the New South Wales Health Department when she was speaking to a press conference last week. She was literally in tears. Literally in tears. It's just...
You worked in the New South Wales government, and if you were still there now and that video suddenly emerged, can you just talk us through what would happen? What would the reaction be within government when something like that occurs?
Yeah, well, you know, something like that would have come to the attention of the Premier's office. I guess the way that this story came to light, it really came through the media, so it would have actually been, you know.
So you're reacting? Yeah,
it would have been the office I was working in, the media office, would have immediately sort of informed the Premier about this, and that would have triggered a discussion within the Premier's office and obviously with officers outside, with the New South Wales Police and so on. But
I am surprised that there aren't charges yet. So obviously we've had this kind of hilarious Keystone Cops aspect of the detectives who have asked for the full video, have gone to the influencer and DM'd him, but haven't sent him the full email address, just police.newsouthwales.gov.au, not the first part with the @ meaning that there was a bit of a delay. But I've watched the full video, you have as well. What do you make of the full video?
Well, look, you know, it does, the two nurses seem to get talked into saying some very silly things. You know, what were they doing on this platform? Presumably, well, obviously at the hospital, I don't know. That was the first mistake. And sure, like some people have tried to argue that, you know, the nurses were goaded into saying this, and you know, you can say that, but you know.
But what did he say to goad them, other than I was in the IDF, which every young man has to be in?
Well, yeah, that's right. But I guess I reject the idea that they were somehow tricked into saying these things, because yes, a viewing of the video doesn't really show anything else. You know, the first line of defence of some people that we saw happen last week was, oh, this video's, you know, it's just, you know, it's out of context, blah, blah, blah. And well, you know, seriously, what's the context? But even when you do see the context, there's really not a lot to suggest that that this guy's been putting words into their mouth.
I was shocked how many people contacted me saying that they thought the video was fake, and they thought that the whole thing had been staged as a way to rile up the right wing of Australia and to have an anti-immigration stance. It's really clear that this was not fake, and I wonder whether we will see charges. I mean, we've heard the New South Wales Police Commissioner, Commissioner Webb, say that this does fall into what she believes to be a hate crime.
Yeah, look, this is where we are today, is that, you know, things like this come to light, and depending on whether you're on this side or the other side, you will immediately put forward views, you know, trying to undermine or support the case, you know, despite not having any evidence. That's just where we are, and this has been a great example of it. As for the question of police charges, why is it taking so long? Well, I think the police would be probably consulting with the Director of Public Prosecutions, potentially, because, you know, actually, has a crime been committed when this is a private, you know, was a private conversation on a social media platform? The awkward truth may be that no crime has been committed here.
When it comes to two men, I think about the number of cases I've covered as a journalist, two adult men on Snapchat getting caught talking about young boys. Someone gets a charge.
Yes, well, that's...
No crime has been committed in terms of a physical crime, but talking about doing something. What's the difference? I
understand that there is, in principle, an inconsistency there, but there, with regards to the law as it stands, to discuss something like in that Snapchat case, it does actually trigger a criminal charge, whereas the discussion that was held by the nurses does not. So
it enters war crime territory, doesn't it? It enters that kind of territory of, do we charge people for having a conversation about something? Is it inciting violence? Does it create violence? Were they plotting or planning? I mean, again, we've got federal police and security agencies who are monitoring people's phones that they are worried that are high risk, and I would imagine that if these two had were being monitored by ASIO and then they spoke about this, they would probably move. The federal police would move on something like this.
If they were discussing, most certainly, if they were having a conversation about an actual incident where the death of a patient had been caused, yes, absolutely. But in this conversation, it's not entirely clear that they were talking about an actual incident. It just sounds like they're making it up. And while that doesn't totally negate what was said, I think as the law stands, it is much more difficult to prove that a crime has been committed.
All right. Ash, when we hear about fact-checking, people often say facts are facts, how can they be wrong? But as we know, sometimes facts can be in the eye of the beholder, who withhold the ones that they don't want to talk about.
Well, often it's the case of, well, which facts do you choose to check? If we take the example of the Voice referendum in Australia from almost a couple of years ago now, it seems that the overwhelming number of fact checks were performed on proponents of the no case, whereas proponents of the yes case, their facts were seldom checked. And that's where the problem has arisen from. And this is, I guess, really gets to the heart of what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about a few weeks back.
And Elon Musk at X, when he took over, he went straight through and said, this is political. Yeah. And we've now seen Mark Zuckerberg say that during COVID, the amount of pressure that was applied on Meta from the Biden administration and health officials to ditch anyone who was being critical or to minimise them. In terms of the Voice, you mentioned Peter Credlin, who's a former chief of staff to Tony Abbott, and also a commentator on Sky News. She had a story about what she believed was 19 pages of the Voice, not the one page that people were being told about. Sky News then found that they were being fact-checked by this unit at RMIT, and that unit through Facebook then started to throttle the posts from Sky News on Facebook so that they weren't really reaching many people. It became a hugely divisive topic. The ABC got involved in this as well, on this one too. The issue is, as I say, is that it feels like, as you say, one side is being targeted.
Yeah, I mean, when was the last time you saw ABC Fact Check do a thorough analysis of claims made about renewable energy? It just doesn't happen. The claims are always targeted at, I guess, essentially, the fact checks are always targeted against the right. I mean, occasionally you see the ABC do one that targets the government or something like that, but that's just to kind of make it look like they're being even-handed. But the reality is, and I think this really comes to the heart of it, is that the fact checkers actually don't think that these issues are worth fact-checking, as in issues that maybe lean towards the left. It just doesn't happen because, well, how can that be wrong?
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think ultimately the fact-check industry did grow out of universities. And universities are, I think I'm not going to be Robinson Crusoe here to say that they're particularly hostile towards the conservative side of politics. And through that culture, some like at RMIT, they were connected with the journalism and media studies faculties at that university, which again are hardly friendly to the conservative side of politics. So because they've grown out of that environment, of course, it shouldn't surprise anyone that they reflect those values. But the real, and having a little office tucked away in a university somewhere is one thing, that's fine. But because such a mega corporation like Meta relies on these essentially left-wing university fact-checking units to be the arbiters of truth for the world, that's where the real danger arose.
What I feel that this is an example of is the pendulum swinging when there's a different administration. Meta deliberately would have sided with a left-wing organisation like RMIT University in order to be able to curry favour with the administrations at the time, that now they don't have to, and so now they're separating themselves from. It feels like the facts only matter depending, or fact-checking only matters depending on who's in power, but then when they're in power, the fact-checking can quite easily be pushed. I mean, we've had accusations that the Bureau of Meteorology staff were withholding some of the cooler years on record to make things look like it was getting warmer over the course of a century. And that was because they had brought two departments together, climate and weather, as opposed to just having them as separate organisations. That becomes a problem, does it not, where within organisations, activists essentially take over the fact-checking side. You think about news organisations that have an opinion side and a news side, and that all goes really well until they start to cross over.
Well, let's look even further into actual media organisations where, and this has happened in organisations around the world, it's happened at the New York Times, it's happened in all sorts of places where a younger cadre of activist journalists start bullying senior management into cowering to their outlook on the world. Hey, here's a radical idea. Why don't journalists be journalists and just consider things with an open mind? Look, the danger is that if we swing the other way, there is a risk that that there will be this right-wing political correctness that overtakes everything, and that is equally as dangerous. Journalists are supposed to be open-minded individuals, but I feel like they are a dying breed.
I remember doing election coverage or planning for it here at Ticker once, and we had someone who was working here who said, if you make me work a weekend, I'll quit. And then obviously elections happen on weekends. Turned out that individual was actually not wanting to come because he was attending an ALP event on election night, and that was the political persuasion of that person. And it makes it really hard, right? A news organisation, you don't want people who are choosing a side, you want them to be heavily involved in the election coverage. And that becomes a real challenge when hiring, particularly with very entitled younger staff. Look,
there is, this is obviously a real issue today. there is, you know, if you're interested in politics, there are different ways of approaching that interest. You can approach it through being involved in the media, as I initially did. You can approach it through being involved more directly in politics in a party or in government. And there is a bit of a crossover between the two. I think that as long as you're honest about these things, if you're open about your affiliations, I think that certainly mitigates things. But far too often, journalists, and I say this as a former journalist, but far too often journalists see themselves more in the role of a priest to lecture and deliver sermons to the public rather than actually informing them.
How ironic. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are facing backlash for overshadowing the veterans at the Invictus Games. The couple's recent appearance drew criticism after Harry appeared to take a jab at Donald Trump during his speech. An insider expressed frustration, stating that their actions have become a distraction from the true purpose of the event, which is to support the veterans. This is an interesting topic because, again, it's them versus Donald Trump, and obviously Trump has caused a bit of catastrophe to them by saying Harry can stay because he's got enough problems to worry about with his wife. What actually happened at the Invictus Games? What did Harry do?
Oh, well, he did. He started off by delivering. No, wait. I'll let me go back one step. Meghan started off by delivering a speech introducing Harry, who then spoke about people, you know, of loose morals. No, sorry, not loose morals. You know, questionable morals, right, and all of that sort of thing. But I think the bottom line here is that Meghan has managed to overshadow the whole damn thing. You know, do you know?
Has it become a platform? Is that what the issue is? That the Invictus Games are essentially a way to get people together to have to listen to them.
Well, does anyone know anything about any of the competitors from the Invictus Games? No, it's all been about Meghan, and a second part of that has been Harry.
Well, what did Harry say? What did Harry do?
Well, I don't know. I
can tell you. I read the article that you sent.
All I know is about Meghan. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Harry's point. He hit out at Donald Trump, and this, of course, comes after Trump had threatened and then decided to go against the booting him out because there was an issue about drugs. Is that right? About Harry getting citizenship to the US?
Well, there's a discrepancy between a statement he made to the authorities when entering the country and the statement he made in his book. So
it's quite interesting that a lot of the royal pundits in London have said that the King would be so relieved that Donald Trump didn't kick Harry out of the US because then he'd be his problem again. What do you think of that?
Well, that's I guess one way of looking at it. Look, I'm sure that the King would actually dearly love to be properly reconciled with his son, but it seems that so long as a certain former Suits actress is about, that's probably not going to happen.
All right, we'll leave it there. Ashley Gardner, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.